Good morning. Thank you for joining us for today's coffee talk. Excuse me. My name is Sean O'Brien, president of QuickRate, and as always, I'm pleased to be joined by Steve Huntington. Steve, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us today for another edition of Coffee Talk. My name is Steve Huntington. I'm a director of analytics here and spent my entire career working with community financial institutions all around the country and spent more than half of that here with Sean at QuickRate.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. Just a reminder, we will send out a link to with a recording and a copy of today's slides, likely on Monday afternoon. If you want to, as we move through the presentation today, again, always we encourage questions. You can do that or submit those questions by using the Q&A box or the chat feature, and we'll monitor those as we always do throughout the presentation. You either stop in the midst of the presentation or certainly take those at the end. Again, our goal here is really just to kind of continue to share now more than ever, just kind of what we're hearing, what we're seeing, questions we're fielding from banks, questions you might be getting from auditors. So again, just trying to keep everything as top of mind and as current, and be sensitive to the environment that we're working in. So again, appreciate as always that you made some time out of your day to come and join this. We'll start with a few polling questions as we like to do. I think we've got 5 today, so many of them are very familiar. One actually came from one of our subscribers, but we'll go ahead and give these about 30 to 45 seconds. The first one is just CRE concerns. Which CRE subsets give you the most concern this year? And so we just got a kind of a multiple choice option here. I realized we didn't put ag on there. Now that I look at that, that was a miss. Sorry about that. Okay. And this one, and share those. So office still kind of remains a priority. Again, I apologize. I somehow forgot to include ag on this. Next up, retail, and then multifamily, 1 to 4 family rental, and then industrial. So thank you very much for participating. The next question is just around the loan portfolio. Again, did your loan portfolio increase or decrease in size in Q1? Stayed the same. Okay. Yeah, that's encouraging with all the uncertainty. 55% of you saw an increase in your loan portfolio, 24% stayed the same, and 21% saw a decrease. Next up, just past due loans. Did you see any increase in your past due loans in Q1? All right. Sure, these 63% of you did not, 37% of you did see an increase. So we'll move to the next question. Just on charge-offs, kind of similar. Did you charge off any loans in Q1? 60% of you did not. 40% of you, oops, I didn't share that. Oops, there we go. 60% of you responded no, 40% responded yes. And then the final question, again, this was came from one of our customers, just regarding any forward-looking predictive measures that you might use with your Q factors. Whether it's the University of Michigan consumer sentiment, if it's unemployment, anything that you use or look at maybe as a correlative economic factor. We're kind of curious what you're using, and if you don't mind the second part of the question, if you answered yes, what do you use? So is kind of the idea here, just to see what other banks are, if any, looking at any forward-looking economic ratios, or using any economic ratios as forward-looking.
Sean, don't scroll ahead into the presentation where we show all the Fed trends to let anybody cheat on the question here.
Is that our next slide?
No,
Yeah.
a couple down.
I know
a couple down.
Yeah. Okay, this is great. I appreciate, again, this is actually pretty interesting. Kind of evenly split, 50-50 are using them. And then what people are using. Let's see if I can actually see this. Oh, I was hoping it was gonna let me see it, but it didn't. Yeah, we'll include those results in the follow-up email, but I gotta get back my screen here. We did have a question.
Well, we did have, yeah, the question was a comment.
Yeah. Great. All right, so let me get rid of that. Steve, you can see my presentation again, right?
Yeah.
Good. Okay.
Yeah, but
so
the poll is still open, though.
Gotcha. All right, let me get that. Okay. All right. I was hoping we could see the details, but we could. So thank you all again for participating. And then we'll get going. So again, just a reminder, we've tried to continually just make updates and enhancements, both in terms of new features, hopefully things to make operationally a little bit easier to use. So this is just kind of a reminder of some of those. And we do have a couple of coming soon, as you can see, at the bottom, that we'll talk a little bit about as well. Steve, anything you want to add here?
Yeah, just a reminder that a couple months ago, the Fed updated their stress testing economic trends and projections, 3-year quarterly projections going forward. That's done in mid-February of every year, and so that is up on our site, and we'll share that screen of what those updates look like. And if you're looking for any other economic trends that have a robust historical data set and then project on an apples-to-apples basis out into the future, especially on a quarterly basis, those are some good ones and very well-known ones to use. As far as the coming soon is concerned, we've already kind of shared a couple times the additional flexibility that we're going to be adding to the peer historical loss analysis to allow you guys to increase or decrease your sort of percentile rank of the peer data, so you can sort of stress the peer historical trends to higher than median loss levels in the future, and that'll allow you to kind of have a little bit of more flexibility in how punitive you want to be when you're thinking about peer experience as it pertains to the reserve analysis. And then finally, I don't know if I'd mentioned this before, but we're busily working on an additional methodology option for unfunded commitments. We were of the opinion when we were developing the tool years back in conjunction with the FDIC and other regulators that our take on the unfunded commitments was relatively straightforward, and still believe it is, but we constantly are listening to feedback from auditors and from examiners and from all of our users. And we thought that there was a kind of an even simpler take on the unfunded commitment calculations that we could provide as an alternative that that might be maybe easier to smoother to defend because there's even less kind of assumptions built into it. And so we're working on that as an alternative, and we'll have that ready pretty in the next couple months here for y'all. Yeah, and that's it for the enhancements.
Great. And we'll talk more about that that unfunded commitments, because like Steve said, we're keeping what we have, but we're just providing another option for you as well. So, again, I think we're kind of at that point in time where, a lot of you are continuing to maybe be on your second round of audits or reviews with auditors, your examiners. So again, we're fielding a lot of questions, and so we want to just kind of share, with you not only what some of those questions are, but where some of those tools that are available to help you better answer those questions or respond to those inquiries. So we're just going to touch on some of the more common ones we're getting just as a reminder. So Steve, take it away.
Yeah, and then that brings up a good point. Because a lot of you, most all of you at this point, are in your second sort of exam cycle as it pertains to CECL. That first exam cycle, when it came to especially things like unfunded commitments, was, have you considered your reserve for unfunded commitments? Yes or no? And if you've done anything to consider it or make an attempt at it, you got kind of a check on the box. And we're seeing in the second exam cycle, now they're saying, well, exactly what are you doing and how are you doing it and what assumptions are going into it? So they're continuing to sharpen the point on their how they examine and how the opinions that our regulators have on more of the kind of the more minor, more detailed points of reserve accounting. Unfunded commitments certainly falls into that category. What you're seeing here right now is what I mentioned earlier. These are the economic trends that the Fed puts out and updates every year. It has 20 years worth of historical quarterly data, and then 2 forward-looking scenarios. And that is pretty much a grouping that Fed kind of gets together all of their different economists that they use, and they get some sort of median or baseline actual economic projections and forward look 3 years or 12 quarters. So the baseline scenario is the actual kind of midpoint or median projection of the economists moving forward. The severely adverse scenario is not a projection set. It is an adverse scenario, right? It's a what if. How bad do you think it could possibly get if it were to get particular or severely adverse, however we subjectively define that. And so that projection set kind of gives you a worst case scenario from the economists, whereas the baseline scenario really is their kind of midline projections. And again, we'll keep updating that every February, but it's there in the CECLSolver tool for you guys to use as a resource or in defense of your qualitative factor adjustments.
Steve, a couple of questions came in. One going back to the additional peer historical loss data that's coming soon. The question is, will that be available for June 30th, Q2?
It's always the question. Hope our expectation is that it will. Everyone keeps telling me to stop promising things by certain dates, but I'm excited about it, and the work is pretty much done, or for the most part done. But we have a lot of customers now, and we need to thoroughly test and vet all that kind of stuff before rolling it out. So our expectation is absolutely yes. If there was some particular reason why you needed that or could really use that data earlier, or if it's not ready by June 30th, if you could get kind of an advanced preview of what it might look like, please reach out to us and I'll see if I could cook something up for you.
And then the second one is just regarding this Fed data. Just a reminder where it is on the site.
Yeah. Let me
go
ahead and share my screen.
Yeah.
Hold on one second here. Give me 1 second. Oh, there it is. Okay, so here's our primary CECLSolver main kind of screen, if I click on the knowledge base, open up a new tab and give me all that knowledge base. And then right down here in the is of economic stress testing scenarios. And if I click on that, that'll open up a new tab with a kind of a clean look of it. And again, here is going all the way up, historical, all the way up to the fourth quarter of last year and going all the way back to the year 2000. Baseline scenario, now we're looking forward, right? So Q1 2025 through Q1 2028, so 3 years worth. And if I click on severely adverse, color-coded red, you'll see all these numbers much more negative. And again, all this, just like anything else, you can export this data to Excel, PDF, print it off any way you want to.
Yeah, and I think again, I think it's to me, it kind of goes without saying, right? We can spend a lot of time trying to do our own economic analysis. We put this out here because, obviously the Fed has as many resources and as many economists and as many people thinking about it, right? So even for like the baseline scenario, it just gives you a good sense of what they're anticipating. And I think, again, from a reasonableness level, right? You can't get any more reasonable than what the Fed is what they're projecting, right? From their baseline scenario.
It's directionally accurate, right? That's we keep saying, I know we keep saying that, month after month, but really, you're never going to find a perfect correlation between one of your segments loss history, in your particular community bank and a yield curve or something like that at the national level. But you get a feel directionally, and the majority of these are going in a certain direction over a certain, quarterly or annual type period. And then if you have an expectation of your losses moving forward that goes in line with that, it just gives you some additional ammunition when having that conversation. Because again, Q factors are all about points for paper, right? There is no right or wrong answer, but you need to have some reasonable justification for the direction that you feel that it's going in. And it doesn't get more reasonable than the regulator's own economists.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we can get lost in the or mired in the day-to-day, and sometimes this just helps you give a little bit of a perspective, right? I mean, so as we're looking at this today, if you start looking at the unemployment rate and where treasuries are, right, their expectation is we're not going to move a whole lot, right? It's going to be mildly the same here over the next couple of years, right? So we may have volatility quarter to quarter or month to month, day to day, but the expectation is from the Fed's point of view, right, is a little bit steady as she goes. And again, with inflation creeping up and then moderately coming down. So again, I think it just helps give some perspective that I think can be helpful when there's so much noise about all this information. All right, let me take back the screen here. And thank you for those questions. Sure. Okay. All right. Oh, come on. There we go. Next up is just a reminder on the scenario organization management tool. Steve, you want to talk about this?
Yeah. So this has been out there for a while. So as long as all of you have run a scenario in the last quarter or so, you've probably already seen this. But just to remind everybody, it was a significant enhancement to the usability of the tool. Now that we've had customers using our tool for 3 years plus at this point, and even if you're only creating 1 or 2 scenarios a quarter, we do have some customers who create a scenario or 2 every month. And the number of scenarios and managing all that historical scenarios was becoming a little bit overwhelming. We wanted to significantly improve the how you kind of interact with those scenarios, keeping track of when they were created, when they were updated, who created and updated them at your institution, and kind of just organizing them a little bit better. So that's what we did here. Hopefully we've gotten good feedback so far. If there's anything that doesn't do or does in a way that you find inefficient or confusing, please let us know. We're always tweaking things to make it more convenient and user-friendly.
And just a reminder, again, Steve has, I'll let you talk to this, just the number of scenarios and just the amount of data that we're actually.
Yeah, we're in this exam cycle, just like with when and we're going to talk about this in a minute. when you're getting more questions about now, people are digging into your warms and asking you to justify where you come up with prepayment estimates and assumptions, and more about the warm look back multiplier and everything else, and you're looking for resources to justify the assumptions that you've made. What's important is that those resources or those databases are robust enough to be reliable and reasonable and comparable to your institution. So this is just for that data that we provide from our CECLSolver user averages trends over time, where you can see what everyone else in our system on aggregate, what they're calculating for their warms by loan segment, what they're calculating for Q factors, what direction your peers' Q factors are going in at the segment level, and then also reserve levels. And of course, none of that is data that you can get publicly anywhere. It doesn't, we haven't seen it to exist anywhere. And since we have so many institutions using our CECLSolver now, this becomes a great resource to see those trends and be able to use them to help justify the assumptions that you've made. And so just kind of reminding everyone, because we get requests for kind of the statistics and how many institutions and how people are using the data, so that our examiners and auditors can get comfortable with some of the assumptions being made. And if you're using those warms or Q factors from the peer set, from the CECLSolver peer set as part of your justification, know that over 350 community banks are running the tool and creating scenarios on a quarterly basis. We've got institutions from 43 out of 50 states, from anywhere from $20 million single branch institutions to large community banks over $5 billion in assets. Average size, about 400 million in assets. And our users have run, thousands and thousands of scenarios.
Yep. Okay, so prepayment speed.
Yeah.
This is something we have, I would say, surprisingly, I will say I'm honestly surprised we are getting as many questions about prepayment speeds as we are, but we are getting them. So we decided to talk about them. I'm not sure why auditors seem to be more fixated on this. I'm just gonna get on my soapbox here for a second. I think the two things that people seem to be asking about is why we use the NCUA data, and then secondly, just even the questions about the prepayment speeds, right? There's a reasonableness, factor here or point that when we first started looking at this, prepayment speeds are something you can go down a very long and large rabbit hole to actually have to define your own. The standard calls for just something that's reasonable and supportable. The OCC and the Fed or the FDIC did not provide any guidance on prepayment speed. The NCUA did. So we, at a minimum, thought, again, not ideal that it's not banks, but it's certainly not unreasonable to see what other financial institutions are seeing from a prepayment speed estimate. So that's why we built that into our warm tool. Again, I can't emphasize this enough. To do your own prepayment study, just like for the difference it's going to make in the warm, is just not material enough for us to say you should do it. So that was the background on why we constructed the tool this way. All right, so I'll jump off my soapbox and let Steve talk here.
Yeah, I mean, prepayment, doing your own proprietary prepayment study requires more effort than doing an entire warm calculation with your loan level data. So, and of course, there's different levels of it. You can get more granular or more sophisticated with a prepayment study, but it requires at a minimum looking at each of the loans in your segments and honestly looking at them by cohorts, slicing and dicing them by vintage, because prepayments obviously are different with new loans than they are with more seasoned loans. And so it can get very, very complicated, they're time consuming and expensive to do that. So we were desperately looking for some sort of industry resource that could circumvent the need to spend that much time and energy on something that it really has a somewhat minimal effect in most reasonable situations. The first thing that we found before the NCUA came out with this, if you go to the next slide for a second,
Yeah.
some of our older customers might remember this or might still use it. The best thing that we could find anywhere publicly was the FHFA publishes a quarterly prepayment monitoring report. It's a very long report they put out each quarter, but there's one chart in there, I think it's on page 5, which was kind of a single best defense or industry resource for annual prepayment rates on loans, and it was specific to the mortgage industry. And you can see here, this is CPR here in this context stands for conditional prepayment rates. These are monthly conditional prepayment rates, but they were annualized, so each of these numbers is appropriate for apples to apples to an annual prepayment rate that you need for the WARM. So it was about as comparable as you could find, or the right type of calculation. And you can see that, if you remember back in 2020, 2021, when we had some interest rates were still on the way down, and but then as interest rates stabilized and started on the way up, obviously prepayment rates dropped off the map, and they were up to 25% plus per year. But for a while now, for 2.5 years now, they've been hovering in that 5 to 10% range. This was the best source that we could find. Again, it only applied to mortgage loans. It did not apply to all other types of commercial bank loans. But it was the best that we had. When the NCUA decided they needed to provide more support to community financial institutions, they undertook a relatively robust study. They utilized a third-party statistical firm, gathered a lot of loan data, gathered a lot of industry data, and did it by segment. Keep in mind, as you know, as you saw on the last slide, the call report segments for credit unions are a little bit different than they are for commercial banks, but not as different as they used to be. They're actually much more in line than they used to be. So while your regulator or your auditor might have a little bit of uneasiness that you're using data from the credit union industry as opposed to commercial banks, credit unions are being examined and regulated more and more like commercial banks every day and every year. And the data is still collected and is still much more comparable and much more apples to apples and segment level than this. This includes every single mortgage loan that Fannie and Freddie in the United States. So this is heavily weighted towards the couple super international, Wells Fargo, Bank of America type institutions, and not specific at all to community banks or community financial institutions, whereas the NCUA data very much is so. And is done on a quarterly basis and is done at the segment level. So we feel that is by far the most reliable, comparable, publicly available source that's out there. And you'll also notice they happen to be in line, right? We only have this data for mortgage loans, but we're looking at something in the 5 to 10% range. If you head back to the last slide for a second, you'll notice that the prepayment rates that are being calculated right now by the NCUA for typical mortgage loans are right now around 8.2%. So that's what we have as a default for first lien 1 to 4 family. So again, better, more comprehensive data that still happens to be in line with the other publicly available sources that are out there. As to Sean's comment about it not making a huge difference, let me go ahead and show you why.
Yeah, and just while he's doing that, again, when we started this, I think one of the common phrases you heard us say a lot, me in particular, was precision over accuracy, right? And again, you can try to be overly precise and be no more accurate, but you can spend a whole lot of time doing it. And we felt, again, this was one of those examples where the difference between a prepayment speed of 8% or 7%, someone who's looking at precision may say it's not precise enough, but it's accurate because it just, again, does not materially change a WARM that in any significant way. So
this is our updated WARM estimator tool, the Excel file that we have each quarter for our WARM users. Here is that same data I was just showing you. And if I head just to the mortgage loans, so this is kind of the way of most of our institutions are calculating their WARMs now, adjusting them for prepayments and for amortization. So if I were to change this 8.2%, right, that's the number that we see from the NCUA right now. Let me change it to 10% and watch this 1.9 year WARM go from, go from 1.9 to 1.85. So the difference between a 1.9 year WARM and a 1.85 year WARM is going to be absolutely zero for the vast majority of institutions. Why is that? Because again, our WARM defines, how much we looked at back into the past, and we look at how much losses you've had over the last 1.85 years. And that's our basis point to then assume we're going to have losses of a similar amount over the next 1.85 years, except for Q factor adjustments, right? But if you look back 1.9 years versus 1.85 years, in your history, you're going to find a whole heck of a lot of zeros in there. So the actual additional accumulation of net charge-offs historically over 0.05 year additional WARM or less WARM is going to be negligible for the vast majority of you. If I were to take that 8.2% and make it 15%, it's like double. If we were off by a factor of 2 on our prepayment rate, we would go from a 1.9 to a 1.73 year WARM, which would still be relatively innocuous, or not. I mean, it would be
immaterial.
It would be immaterial. So I just want to give you some numbers behind. Obviously, if we were dealing with 3 years ago and people were using 30% prepayments on mortgages, now we start to see a little bit different. Still only a half a year WARM difference, but that could very well be material depending upon your Q factors and how much worse you might expect losses to be over the next couple of years than they were over the last couple of years. But it takes a relatively large difference. So if your examiner or auditor is fighting with you over whether you're using 7% or 7.5%, you can let them know that it's straight from me, that it ain't going to make a hill of beans of difference in your reserve calculation.
Okay, so a question came in, Steve. Is there a way for the WARM to be integrated in the actual calculation the way the Q factors are? Or WARM can only be a forward-looking thing to consider, but not directly impacting the calculating formula?
I don't know.
No.
I'm not sure what that's.
Is really, used to, Steve said, right, it's the basis for the forward-looking projection, right? And in the way the WARM works is that WARM, as Steve said, right, we look back historically at that WARM period, see what the net charge-offs were, and then use that as the basis for coming forward. And so in our tool, that's why you get that calculated historical loss number. Then along with your Q factors, you get to a reserve balance.
Yeah, I mean the WARM is that's not specific to our methodology, right? In
right.
The basic concept of CECL that everyone has to deal with is you're estimating losses over the remaining life of the loan. So your starting point is well, based on history, what would my losses be over the remaining life of my loans? 1.4 years in this case that I gave an example of, and then except for how we think it might be different. Now, I do want to, and we've talked about this before. We're going to talk about this in a second here, is separate the concept of the look back period from the WARM, right? And I don't know if I want to jump ahead to that. Well, I guess it's about time to jump ahead to that anyway. Why don't you share? Hold on. Did you already share that? Why don't you head to the next slide?
Yeah, next slide. Yeah. So
sometimes people get confused between, and we've gotten a lot of calls about this recently about what is the lifetime look back multiplier? What does that mean? And so we have two different concepts here. The primary concept in CECL is to estimate losses over the remaining life of the loan. So over your WARM, right? So the WARM is the more important of the numbers for sure. That's where you're accumulating losses over that period of time moving forward, and that's what you have to estimate. A look back period is just, well, if you're starting with historical data, right? If you're using historical data to estimate what kind of losses you might have over the next 2 years, you look back into the past to see what are 2 years worth of losses I had in the past. But you don't necessarily have to look at 2 years worth of losses to estimate what you might have over a 2-year period. You can look at 15 years worth of historical data and use all that to still estimate what you would have lost on an average 2-year duration in the past. So the look back period is just what historical time period do I want to gather data to then estimate losses over a remaining life or a warm period moving forward. Now, by default, our tool matches the look back period to the warm, which makes sense intuitively to us, because if you're gonna estimate, what kind of losses you're going to see over the remaining life of loans that have a very long remaining life, like a mortgage portfolio, you might want to look further back in history than if you're estimating losses over the remaining life of a construction portfolio that has very, very short duration. So if you're going to go back 15 years on construction loans, you're looking at 25 iterations of your construction portfolio, and you're looking at 1.5 iterations of your mortgage portfolio. So it's not one size fits all in this situation. So what we did was we split the concepts of the look back period and the warm to allow everybody much more flexibility in what historical data they wanted to use. Short, long, it's up to you, and still calculate an appropriate estimated loss over a remaining life or over a warm period moving forward. So if you see here, I just gave a kind of a round number example that, let's say the warm on your mortgage portfolio on your first liens, after taking into account, amortization and prepayments and everything else, is 5 years. Our tool by default can look at a 5-year look back period, which you might say, I've had like no losses over the last 5 years. My entire reserve is going to be Q factors. I don't really like that. I'd love to be able to go far enough back in history to include some of the last stress period that we had back in 2012, 13, 14. So you can take your look back period and bring it all the way back to, in this case, let's say fourth quarter of 2013, and say, all right, now I'm using a 10-year look back period. I still need to calculate 5 years worth of losses, but I'm using a 10-year period to do it. So I add up all my losses over the entire 10 years, and then I have to make it appropriate for a 5-year loss estimate. So I have to divide it by 2 or multiply it by 0.5, right? I've aggregated losses over a 10-year look back. I have to estimate 5 years going forward. So I take that 10-year aggregate, divide it by 2 or multiply it by 5, and get a 5-year loss estimate, forward-looking loss estimate from that 10 years worth of historical data. That's the most kind of straightforward way that I can explain how we do that. And so you see here, when you customize your look back period, you're on the historical analysis tab, like in the screenshot here. If I go and take the start of a look back and drag it back to a lot older, creating a longer look back, it'll immediately recalculate that multiplier for you and tell you, hey, this is what we're multiplying that 10 or 9 or 11 years worth of historical losses by, to get a warm duration forward-looking estimate.
Great. Thanks, Steve. We had another question. Oops, wrong. Came in on the chat. Have you seen banks' actual ACL to total loans ratio below peer around 1%? The answer to that is certainly, yeah. How it's perceived by regulators. Again, I think it's unique with every bank and every examiner, right? Because as Steve will show in a subsequent slide, there's definitely a lot of different biases, where reserve levels are, right? Again, I think industry, most people say you're usually safe if you're around 1.2, but as Steve will show geographically, right, reserve levels vary across the country. So I think a lot of it has to do with your own bank's history and relationship with the examiners.
If you're in the Northeast, you're lucky. I'll
yeah.
I'll point that out. They have geographically, the Northeast region is much less. It's how there's 2 very important points there. What does your loan portfolio look like from a risk perspective historically, right? What types of loans have you guys done? Did you experience the last credit downturn at all, or were you completely insulated even during 2009, 10, 11 from the last industry downturn? Are you heavy do you have heavy concentrations in loans that historically have caused stress to examiners and to the industry? Right? Do you have high, CRE concentrations? There's flags, right, that examiners are looking for, that whether you actually have additional risk there, or whether you just fit into buckets that cause them to look more closely, is what it comes down to, and how you define your peer group. If you are different than peers geographically because of your mix, because of your history, because of your risk profile, you should be spending a good deal of time building a custom peer group that accurately reflects not just where you live and what size your institution is, but what your mix is, what your historical risk has been, what your historical asset quality has been. We have a lot of flexibility in building really custom good peer groups that can more accurately compare you to them, where you might say, well, I got a lower reserve than UBPR peer group 5, but that includes a bunch of Southern California community banks and Florida community banks that got crushed last time. And I'm in rural Maine, and I haven't seen a charge off in 15 years. I should not be compared to that peer group. That's a bad comparison. So I think it's inaccurately looking at peer data and then considering those other factors. But we see hundreds and hundreds of examples of institutions that have 80, 90 basis points in reserves, and have historically and continue to have. CECL didn't kind of invalidate the below average reserve level.
Right. Yeah. So thank you all to in the chat who responded. Again, I think those are all very well said. And Martha, certainly, if you have any additional questions, we're happy to talk one-on-one after this. All right. Next up, just a reminder, the CECLSolver, the Excel-based auditing validation tools available. In the toolbox. So Steve, anything you want to touch on here before we move on?
No. So this again is, I want to see if there was anything I needed to point out. I'm going to go ahead and show them that for a second, actually.
Okay.
I think it's worthwhile to do that here.
Yeah. And maybe just a reminder too, just on the calculation. I know I had a question from a bank, using the tool, just on how the average balance is calculated. You always have to kind of average that first quarter.
So yeah. When we're calculating loss rates over time, you always have to, a loss rate over time is one of those annualized type ratios where you have an income statement thing on top, right? Like charge-offs that accumulate over time. And your denominator is a point in time number, like assets. But it's an average balance of those assets over time. So in order to calculate a net charge-off ratio for, let's say, just the first quarter of this year, you only need the 331 number for charge-offs, right? But you need the 1231 number and the 331 number for total assets to calculate average assets over that period of time that you accumulated those net charge-offs that are your numerator. So you always have to have one additional period in your denominator for calculating those, just like with an ROA, right? An ROA or a net interest margin. You have to have that beginning point for end of period numbers. So you have to go back an additional quarter for that. I hope that explains a little better. Let me share my screen here. I know we've shown screenshots of this Excel validation tool and stuff in the past, but I thought it might be helpful to just briefly show you guys what it has, so that you can use it if you need to. It's certainly not something you have to use at all. The vast majority of our customers, our users, never have to download or update or use this tool. However, if you get into a bit of a sticky wicket with your examiner or your auditor, and they're drilling hard on a particular calculation or number, and they want to see that you've got it and you're following it and you have access to every one of those numbers, and it's not a black box, or you're not just relying on us completely, we do have this file. It is designed to perfectly mirror the historical tab of the CECLSolver. So you'll notice it works the same way, right? You click on the historical tab, you'll see here are my end of period loan balances. Here are my gross charge-offs. gross recoveries, net charge-offs, and net charge-off ratio. So this is really what we're looking for, is our net charge-off ratios over time, and then over the entire look-back period. So our lifetime loss rate, and then our multiplier, lifetime look-back multiplier. Hold on here. Yeah, and then our historical lifetime loss rate. So what this does is this Excel model pulls every single call report value. These are the raw data, is call report values, completely unmanipulated by us in any way, shape, or form. It goes all the way back. So there's a ton of data here, but these are just, balances, charge-offs, recoveries, year to date, right? That's what's on your call report. Then you have to take a bunch of intermediary steps. How do I get from a year to date charge-off number to a quarterly net charge-off ratio? A lot of steps, actually. You've got to turn the year-to-dates into quarters. You've got to subtract recoveries from charge-offs. You got to do all these additional steps. So these are all those intermediary steps and math that takes you from each call report value to what you get in the actual spread formatted page on the CECLSolver tool. And those are, what are my historical net charge-off ratios? What is my lifetime loss or lifetime loss rate over the look back period, and our multiplier, and then so it works the same way. You can change your look back period if you want to customize your look back periods the same way you would in the tool. Type in your warm. So the idea is you create a scenario using our interactive tool, and if you're required to show them some additional validation that you can't get in any other way, you can come in here, plug in the same values that you have in your scenario for warms and look back periods, and it will show the calculation all the way back to every single traceable call report value. So it is overkill for any, unless you've kind of been required to do this, but in those cases, we do offer this tool, and it will be the end all be all, so to speak, from that perspective.
Yeah, Steve said, right, it's when you're asked to show your work, this is really what allows you to show your work.
Yeah.
Okay, let me grab back the screen here. Okay, next up, just some industry trends again, with the new quarterly data. So Steve, take it away.
Hold on, let me get back to. Yeah, so last time we had a coffee talk, it was just after the end of the quarter, and we hadn't filed our call reports yet, and I think it was like April 6th or something. So pretty much nobody had filed their call reports yet. And so we didn't have that first quarter data, but I always like to share these trends as soon as they're available. And so it's a continuation of what we have seen for at least a year, if not 2 years at this point. Past dues are creeping up. They continue to creep up. You notice that little spark line on the right-hand side there. The red dot represents the highest value over the last 9 quarters or two plus years. Almost all those red dots are the first quarter of this year, except for, interestingly, we have been watching consumer loans because they've been kind of leading the trend in asset quality deterioration recently. But we saw a little bit of a dip in past dues in total consumer loans for community banks around the country, which this is, I guess, I used UBPR peer group 5 for efficacy on this particular one. But I thought it was interesting to see that we saw a little dip there, but every other segment of the portfolio has been seeing continual increases, although not drastic, in 30 to 89 days past due. Let's go a little bit further into the cycle. What happens next? Well, some of them become non-accruals. What direction are non-accruals headed in at the segment level? And notice I'm looking at not just median values, but also 75th percentile values, because for things like consumer loans, for example, median non-accruals are still 0, meaning more than half of you out there have 0 non-accruals in consumer. But for those of you that do have some losses, what direction are they headed in, right? Even more leading indicator of where the industry is sort of heading. And so we look at 75th percentile as well. And what we see, pretty much the same thing. Every segment other than consumer has continued marginally seeing a little bit of deterioration. Whereas consumer loans, for the first time in a while, saw a slight but not completely insignificant improvement. And then finally, where the rubber really meets the road is charge-offs. Now, those first two indicators we were looking at, those are balance sheet items, right? Whereas a charge-off is an income statement item. And so we have to consider seasonality and cyclicality in charge-off trends, which is why when we're talking about things like charge-offs, we really want to compare the period to the same period a year earlier, because there is a very distinct trend in the banking industry of kitchen sinking the fourth quarter and starting fresh the next year. And so you always see a spike in charge-offs in the fourth quarter, and it almost always dips in the fourth quarter, or in the first quarter of the next year. So I circled first quarter of 2024 and first quarter of 2025, and you will see where we see any change is deterioration in C&I, and a little bit also, or actually kind of mixed in consumer loans. So it's starting to, some of that additional stress on asset quality is starting to, especially at the 75th percentile, start making it to the actual income statement.
Mm-hmm.
This is where we did a little bit of extra slicing and dicing and geographically. And I'm sorry that I got to get this fixed. The color coordination on the chart does not match the color coordination on the map. The regions are the same regions, but I have to make the colors match. So what you'll see here is, interestingly, for the first time, so we've been seeing this trend of cracks in the armor of asset quality, but at the same time, no increases in reserves to account for those cracks in the armor. And so that would suggest to me that the industry felt that even though asset quality was not headed in the right direction, it wasn't going rapidly in the wrong direction, and we must have been over-reserved before that started, which is exactly what we probably were. At the beginning of CECL, when CECL became the law of the land 2.5 years ago at this point, everyone, not everyone, but the industry saw a significant jump in reserves without any corresponding jump or deterioration in asset quality. So we've had some correction down in reserves, and some asset quality has been deteriorating. But if it continues that way, we'll eventually have to see those reserves start coming up some to account for it. And this is the first time we've seen any of it. And it's very minor. In the first quarter, Western community banks had a 1 basis point median increase in reserves. It's the first increase that we've seen in the last couple of years, and the Midwest as well. So further west you go, but we're talking a basis point or two. But it's the first uptick that we've seen in the last 1.5 or 2 years. So I thought that was minor but meaningful. So we did, this is something that I know I pointed out a bunch of times, another tool on QwickAnalytics that you can use to do some industry research. And I was curious, I started poking around with consumer loans, right? We've seen the deterioration in asset quality in consumer loans over the last couple of years, and wanted to dig in a little bit more and say, you know what, looking at all the community banks in the country, and not thinking about just percentage losses or percentage of past dues in consumers, but what about just the total volume? What dollar amount of consumer loans is 30 to 89 days past due around the country for community banks? And as you can see, interestingly, right now, it's about 25% higher. There's $1.2 billion in community bank consumer loans that are 30 to 89 days past due right now. That compares to 950 million total in the entire country back in 2013, which was the peak of the last asset credit cycle. So from an aggregate dollar standpoint, we have more problem loans now in consumer loans than we did in 2013. However, nothing is in a vacuum. So if we head to the next slide, we'll see, well, yeah, we have a lot more of those loans that are past due. We have a lot more loans, right? The banking total loans in the banking industry has continued to increase year over year for the last decade, and is significantly higher now than it was back then. So on a percentage basis, we peaked at almost 1.7% of consumer loans being 30 to 89 days past due at the peak of the last credit cycle. And we're at 137, right? After being at 1% 4 years ago, we're now at 137. So We have still seen a 37% increase in the percent of consumer loans past due over the last 4 years, but it's significantly less on a percentage basis than it was in 2011. So I thought that was an interesting two different ways to look at the same or similar data, right? To try to find out what the story really is. And then finally, last slide.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. So let's compare those. Let's put our reserves next to our non-performing loans and see, well, what is, again, nothing happened. None of this is in a vacuum. The reserves you need and the need to be compared to the actual non-performers that you're experiencing. To get a feel for whether your reserve is adequate, it has to be compared to the asset quality that you have. So if we look back to, and this is just over the last 5 years or so, at the end of the last downturn, and I don't have this on the chart, but I've looked at a lot of these numbers over in my days. We were at about 250%. Our reserve for community banks was about 250% of our total non-performing loans. That's 90 days past due, non-accrual, and restructured. So it's made its way up from 250% all the way up to 900% about 2 years ago. But what's happened over the last 2 years? What I just mentioned, right? We've seen, some increases in non-performing loans, but at the same time, we haven't seen corresponding increases to the reserve. We've seen decreases to the reserve because it was probably over-reserved as an industry. And guess when that peak was? Exactly at the beginning of CECL. There's, that's hit the nail on the head. 3/31/2023 was the first period that we had to recalculate our reserves under CECL. And so that's why our reserves to non-performers went at its highest point in recorded history. And it has worked its way back down to 687% in the first quarter of this year. Question is, where's the balance line, right? Where does the industry feel like we have a good amount of reserves for the asset quality that our industry has? Don't have the answer to that. It's gone from 250% 10 years ago to 900% 2 years ago and down to 687%. So your guess is as good as mine where the equilibrium is there. But I don't expect that number to continue declining. And if it stops declining, it's because asset quality suddenly starts improving again, or our reserves as an industry start ticking up.
Yeah.
Numerator, denominator.
All right. Certainly any other questions, go ahead and submit those now. We'll certainly monitor those and take those before we go. Just a reminder, this presentation, again, we will send a link to the recording and a copy of the slides, likely on Monday afternoon. But you can always go to our YouTube channel. The link here is at the bottom, and you can find all of our historical webinars and videos. For those of you who still are unaware or looking for even more granular detail on your loan portfolio, I'd certainly encourage you to look at our IntelliCredit solution, in particular our portfolio analyzer. We use loan level data here, and this can really, again, be much more granular and much more informative about your portfolio, as well as just, as a tool for, reporting and communication through the bank, just, again, getting more immediate analysis of your loan portfolio. We did a loan data webinar last week with Cindy Chang from the Pacific Coast Bankers Bank. Certainly encourage you to go out and watch that if you were unable to attend. I think it was a really good explanation and demonstration of how we work with our banks to help not only create some reports, but be interactive in getting you going and finding the reports to create that are most impactful for your institution. A couple of other events coming up next Tuesday. I think it's Tuesday. We have our Q1 Trends webinar, May 21st. I think that's Tuesday. David Ruffin and myself and Aaron from Infusion Marketing Services will be handling that. We'll be back for a coffee talk discussing loan review best practices on June 6th. And then Steve and I'll return for coffee talk on June 27th. So again, always. And
on the quarterly trends one, I'm making a cameo, and I'll be showing off something that none of you have seen yet, which I'm excited. We're excited to give everyone a preview for. So if you didn't have enough reason to show up, Now you got one
Now you
more.
got a better one. Got a better one. And then Stephen, I'll be back on June 27th for the next edition of Coffee Talk. So again, I don't see any additional questions. Steve, any final thoughts before we let everybody go?
Nope. Well, I'm not sure why this camera is showing me as having spent a lot of time in the sun. I have not, but I'm actually headed to Wilmington for the weekend. So next time everyone sees me, I might look like an actual beet red on this camera, like a lobster.
Well, enjoy the time at the beach. Thank you all again for joining us today. We'll look forward to seeing you next month. And certainly any questions in the interim, reach out to us at info@quickrate.com or reach out to Pam or Melissa and we can get something scheduled if you need to talk to Steve or myself. And we'll, again, look forward to seeing you next month. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody.